Hello, and welcome to this session of Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church. I'm Peter Pettit, teaching pastor at St. Paul, and this fall of 2020, we are studying the book by Glenn R. Paauw, Saving the Bible from Ourselves, and the ideas that emerge from it. This session, we will be looking at Paauw's chapters 12 and 13, My Private Bible, and Sharing Our Synagogue Bible. In this pair of chapters, Paauw is approaching the question not so much what is the Bible for, but more who is the Bible for? And his clear response paraphrases Abraham Lincoln in saying that the Bible is a document, a compilation, a gift from the ages that is of the community, by the community, and for the community. And from that characterization, he moves on to suggest what it is that we might do with the Bible and how best we might go about doing it. By now, we can be pretty familiar, if we've been reading through Paauw and in these conversations, we can be pretty familiar with this fundamental dynamic that Paauw discerns in our contemporary use of the Bible. Again, to make, in this case, a biblical reference, I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't quote this from Paul's letter to the Romans. But the question might be, why is it that the Bible has been conformed to the patterns of this world rather than having it transform the world through the renewal that it offers? For those of you who still use chapter and verses, I'm with you. That's a reference to Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And that's really what Paauw is asking for, isn't it? He shows us the ways in which our use of the Bible, our understanding of the Bible, has become conformed to a kind of individualism, which he traces back all the way to the beginning of the philosophical development of the individual, he says, in the 12th century. And then certainly that gains momentum with the Enlightenment in the 17th century. And he sees it playing out especially in the very individualistic kind of culture that is particular to the United States of America. And it's to that culture and to that notion of the individual as the center of meaning in the universe that he sees the Bible and our use of it having been conformed. He talks about it as the me first, mine second Bible. And what he's asking in this case is that we recover more of the Bible's own self-evident character as both the product of community and something which aims to shape community. Not to ignore personal identity, individual identity, but to see the communal as the place in which the individual is grounded and from which the individual takes a measure of identity and purpose, always in relationship to the community. As he says on page 168, the overriding concern of the Bible in all its many pages is to form the lives of a new community. It is the lives, plural individuals, of a new community in relationship to the whole. And so he also suggests that the path toward this recovery, the path toward this renewal of a more biblical understanding of the Bible and of ourselves, is actually through communal practices. He shows us the examples of Jesus and of Paul, and he cites Jesus in the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke's gospel, that's chapter 4, and of Paul in the account of Paul at Pisidian Antioch in the book of Acts, where he says that the practice of Jesus and Paul both of being in the synagogue, of going to the synagogue, he says it is customary that they are there, not unusual, but customary that they are there, that their experience there is scripture centered. Both of these men, when they are in the synagogue, Paauw points out, are invited to interpret the scripture that is read. And it's not as though they got the word a week or 10 days in advance so they could prepare their homily. It's extemporaneous, it's on the spot, it's innovative, it's creative, and it's interactive. They not only interpret the scripture, but then they invite those others who are present, their listeners, their hearers, their fellow biblically shaped community members, to be involved in the conversation and to engage themselves in it. Honestly, as I read this part of Paauw's chapters, it struck me how much the heart, soul, mind community of St. Paul actually resembles this. It's customary for people to come to Heart, Soul, Mind, or to participate now on Zoom or however we can be together. And for those who can't be together with us, we miss that customary interaction. We know how important it is to be together by custom, week in and week out, as we grow accustomed to one another's faces and voices and questions and perspectives. So it's customary at Heart, Soul, Mind to be together. It's scripture-centered. That certainly has been the case year after year after year through many, many different leaders, teachers, guides of the study. And it's interactive. I certainly hope that your experience is that the openness is there to the interaction of all of the participants in Heart, Soul, Mind with the study that we're doing at any given time. So I'm just struck by the fact that much of what Paauw asks about is already present for us as a Heart, Soul, Mind community and open to others at St. Paul who might choose to and be able to join us. I'm heartened, of course, by the fact that Paauw notes that leadership matters, it makes a difference, but not as the one who gives the answers, rather as one who guides a discussion in light of a heritage, in our case, Lutheran Christian, in light of the bigger story of the Bible with which a leader might be more familiar than any of the participants, or certainly than some of the participants, and certainly not all. And that the leader's task is not simply to declare, here is the word of the Lord, the one way to understand this, but rather to guide the many voices that are in the community into a fruitful discussion in which there can be respectful interaction, learning from one another, hearing from one another. That openness to difference is another characteristic that Paauw notes about the effective engagement with Scripture, immersion in Scripture that he talks about. And interesting that he gives some of the same examples we've already been discussing about the way in which the Bible shows an openness to diversity. Two accounts of Israel's history, and in one of those, even two accounts of the giving of the Torah or of the creation. Four Gospels that are preserved, and we've seen how those four Gospels have different angles and perspectives and insights onto and into Jesus' life as a paradigm for understanding God's work in the world. In all of these ways, Paauw is asking for the private Bible, which he characterizes so sharply, and in some ways criticizes pretty sharply. I don't know that it deserves to come in for that much criticism. I think the devotional use of the Bible, particularly for those who are also engaged in communal Bible study, the devotional use of the Bible can be a strong and effective buttress to our faith life. But he asks that that privatization of the Bible, which would only have the young girl going home from camp with her Bible and some passages to look up and looking them up on her own at a certain time every day by herself, asking, what does this say to me? Well, I think many of us can recognize the shortcomings of that privatized Bible and the benefit of the sharing in a synagogue type Bible. Synagogue from the Greek literally meaning to draw together. And so a Bible in which people are drawn together around it to read at length, to read thoroughly and deeply, and together to ask the questions of what's happening in this story and what is our place in it. There are two things in Paauw's presentation that I would like to end on and lift up. One that gives me a bit of pause and frankly a little bit of trouble, and the other that I think raises a really interesting question for us. What do I have trouble with? Well, those of you who have worked with me, studied with me, talked with me to any great extent, even earlier in this series, I already raised the question with Paauw about his statement that the synagogue is the obvious place where Paul would go to announce Jesus as the climax of the entire Jewish narrative. Actually, I think Paauw makes a lot of sense there. It was the obvious place for Paul to go to talk about Jesus as the climax, the appropriate climax of the entire Jewish narrative. And yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the obvious place for us to go. Because the story that Paul thought was coming to a climax with Jesus and his death and resurrection, and a return that Paul anticipated might happen, I don't know, maybe next Tuesday. Don't buy green bananas, he's coming back. That climax didn't happen. And in fact, the entire Jewish narrative didn't come to its climax in Jesus as the Jewish community continued to thrive as God's people after the formation of the church. I believe Paul himself wrestled with this toward the end of his writings in the book of Romans, particularly chapters 9 through 11, and we can study that together sometime. I think Paul worked out a way to understand that Jesus, while he is the truth about all of God's work, is not a truth that brings the Jewish narrative to its climax. Rather, it's a truth that brings non-Jews into the Jewish narrative, and they continue as God's people, a group held together commonly by God's calling, but living differently because of their different histories and cultures. That's something we can get into more, but just to raise the caution that Paul may have anticipated Jesus as the appropriate climax to the entire Jewish narrative, but I don't think he ended his life thinking that, and I don't think that we can pick that up from his earlier writings and reinstate them 20 centuries later. Okay, and then the question, It's a great one that Paauw raises implicitly. He points out that both in Luke 4 and for Paul in Pisidian Antioch, their homilies, their sermons, their interpretations of the scripture that they have read is what he has been calling story-ented. It picks up on the big story of God and creation and Israel and Jesus. And it asks the people who are together with Jesus in Nazareth and Paul in Antioch, who are we in this story? What's the next act in this story? How do we participate in this story to help move it toward where it's going? And obviously in this, Paul is hearkening back to our last study with the question, where's it all headed? And he's hearkening back to that story-ented Bible in chapter 9 that he talked about with the illustration of theatrical improvisation. The story of Scripture is, in a sense, an offer that God makes, an improvisation that's come to a certain point. And when we read that story as an offer, then the question it asks of us is not narrowly in a private way, what does this mean for you, or what does this give you, or what can you take from this? But it invites us into the story to say, who will you be in this story? Where is this story moving us as a community? What does this story envision as the end toward which our community is going? And then, how can we find our identity in that story to help to move it forward? It's that kind of reversal, that kind of inversion, that kind of complementarity of communal and individual that Paauw is asking us to consider. Not what does the Bible add to my life, but how does the Bible invite me to find myself in this story and to add to that story in my own individual creative ways, together in a community that is being led forward by God, whose story it finally is. I love the question. I love our conversation. I look forward to being with you again this week. God bless.